Hi, my name's Cash and you're watching Cashed Out Cars. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to remove your power steering from your Miata. Now, this is going to be for NA and NB Miatas. After that, it's a very different process. But if you have an NA or an NB, this is going to take you through the complete process of removing your power steering pump, removing the lines, and getting your car all set to run without power steering. Now, this method is the line looping method. You could go a step further and remove the inner seals from your steering rack, but I'm going to have a separate video on that. And like I said, this is just going to be removing everything and looping those lines. So let's get right into it. To start off, I'll go over how to remove your power steering and AC belt if you haven't done this previously. You'll first need to clear some space to get to the belt tensioner in order to remove this. To do this, you need to remove your intake tube. I loosened up the clamp in the middle of the tube as well as the one that connects to the airflow meter. These are quite simple to remove and only require a Phillips head screwdriver to loosen them up. Once both clamps are loosened, you could get the intake tube out of place. This might take a little bit of pulling and wiggling it around. If it's very stuck, you could heat it up to make the plastic a bit more pliable and therefore easier to remove. Now we could start on the tensioner. I started with the uppermost bolt, which is a 12mm that needs to be held on the backside so it doesn't spin. Just loosen the nut and you don't need to remove it all the way. Once it's loose, you can go ahead and loosen up the nut that's farther down the bracket. This one is a 14mm and this one shouldn't need to be held on the back. Now for the trickiest part of this. The last bolt is hidden behind the power steering pump pulley. You may need to turn the belt in order to get to this. If you need to, you can turn over the engine from the crank pulley using a socket and carefully turning it until you could access the bolt behind the power steering pulley. Once you can access it, go ahead and loosen it up. This one is a 14mm as well, but this one you'll need to hold on the back to prevent it from spinning. Now everything is loose that needs to be, and you could take tension off of the belt using the bolt on the bracket that you already loosened. This is a 12mm. Once it's loose, you could go ahead and pivot this whole assembly, taking more tension off of the belt, and now you'll be able to remove it from your car. Now we could start removing the rest of the power steering system from the vehicle. Begin by draining as much fluid as you can out of the reservoir. While this isn't necessary, it will make the job a bit cleaner, but in general this will be a fairly messy job. I used a fluid extractor on mine, but a syringe will work well along with other methods like turkey basters or whatever you could think of to get fluid out of this reservoir. The same is going to go for all the different lines that we're going to work on during this video. Once it's fairly drained, you could go ahead and loosen up the reservoir to get it out of place. To do this, you'll need to remove the two 10mm bolts that are on either side of it. Now the reservoir will be free except for the lines, which will still be holding that in place. Since my line was extremely frozen due to its age, I cut off the line as this was easier than removing it. If you want to remove it, you could go ahead and get some pliers on the hose clamp that's holding it on and move it out of place and carefully pull at it and use whatever you need to pry the line off until it's actually off. To cut my line, I used an X-Acto knife, but razor blades or utility knives will work just as well or even better. If you plan on reinstalling your system, obviously be more careful, but either way the line is likely to be brittle since these cars are old and they'll probably need to be replaced anyway. Also note that this line will still be full of fluid, so be ready to catch that or extract it. Next, you could go ahead and remove the two fasteners that hold the fitting onto the side of the power steering pump. These are pretty easy to remove and just back them out and then the fitting will come free. Once again, and as with everything with this project, have a rag or a container ready underneath this for when the fluid starts coming out of it. This line loops around and connects directly to the power steering reservoir, so you don't have to disconnect this at the reservoir if you disconnect it here from the pump. The next component that I removed was the power steering cooling loop. This is an aluminum loop that you see here. To do this, there are a few 10mm bolts that hold it on from inside the bumper. I already had my bumper cover off, which did make this whole process quite a bit easier. If you're interested in doing this, I have a video on my channel that shows you how. Anyway, remove the two 10mm bolts and begin freeing up the loop. Next up, you can remove the bracket holding on this loop that's located under the main structure of the front of the car. Once again, it's a 10mm. Finally, there's another one a little bit farther back. Now, the loop should be all the way free except for the line that's holding it on. Remove the rubber line using pliers to release the clamp and by pulling it off. Once again, you might need to use something like a screwdriver to pry the line off of the fitting. Now you could carefully pull the loop from the car. It might be a little bit tricky to remove as it's a fairly tight space that you have to get it through. I ended up disconnecting the line that ran from the rack to this loop to make it easier. Here's the whole loop out of the car so you could see what you're working on. Now we can remove the line coming directly off of the power steering pump. This requires taking the fastener out that holds the bracket on, which is a 12mm. Then you can go ahead and remove the fitting that goes directly onto the pump. Since I didn't have a long wrench that was the correct size, I used a pipe on a shorter wrench to get enough leverage to crack this loose. This wrench was a 22mm. Once it's cracked loose, you could go ahead and remove it all the way, and this line will be free. Next, you could go ahead and remove the power steering pump. To do this, start by removing the 14mm bolt that runs through the tensioner. Once that's out, you could go ahead and remove the long bolt that you loosened up earlier that's inside the pulley. Once again, this will need to be held from the backside and then could be pulled out under the headers. Be sure to remove the small electrical connection that runs to the pump, which can be just pulled out of place. With all those fasteners removed, you can go ahead and remove the pump from your car. It may be a bit stuck at first, but move it back and forth and pull it and pry it, and eventually it'll go. Now you're up to looping the lines, which is what I'm going to do in this video. Alternatively, you could do a true full depower where you remove the interior seals of the rack, but I'm not going to do this for now. I'm just going to loop the lines. I'll have a separate video on how to fully depower your rack on the channel. In order to do this, you'll need to cut the line that you just disconnected from the power steering pump. Alternatively, you could get a different fitting that will screw in, but this is the quick and dirty method that I'm going to do, and it does work fine. To do this, I used a hacksaw blade from underneath the car, and I was able to saw through it. Obviously, this is the point of no return, and if you plan on putting power steering back on, you'll need a new fitting. Once that's cut, go ahead and remove it from your car. Now your system is removed, and the last thing to do is loop the power steering lines so fluid doesn't escape when you turn the wheel. Keeping fluid in the rack keeps it lubricated. If you plug them without looping the lines, you'd build up pressure inside the rack and you wouldn't be able to turn easily, if at all, if the internal seal is functioning properly. Run a line from the one that you just cut to the one that you previously removed the hose from. I used plastic tubing to show you what you need to do in this video, but if you're going to do this as a long-term solution on your car, use a better tube that can withstand heat, and this will hold up much better and you won't have to worry about it melting. So guys, that is going to wrap up this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you found it helpful. Like I said, I'm going to have another video of removing that steering rack from the car and removing the internal seals, which basically makes it a little bit easier to steer without power steering and gives you a little bit better road feel because you don't have the drag of the leftover fluid in there. So, like I said, check my channel for a different video on that. Like this video if you liked it, and subscribe for more. I hope you stick around for the next one.